All right, very good morning, afternoon to all of you here today. My name is Junice. I'm the Executive Director at EcoBusiness, and I know I'm standing between your rumbling bellies and lunch, but this is a very important topic that has already been raised several times in the last two panels. And of course, without further ado, I'm going to go straight into the conversation. And we couldn't have had a better speaker to come and join us on this fireside chat. I'm very pleased to be introducing Dr. Ma Jun. But first of all, maybe I'll just set the context if you don't mind, and we'll go straight into it. So there is a plethora of sustainability-themed financial products, including bonds and funds, ETFs, all becoming a very important part of the sustainability landscape. Banks are taking advantage of this, of course, and with the growing opportunities, they are seeking assurance too that their investments are achieving the desired environmental objectives, but also, most importantly, is market integrity. So the growth of taxonomy and its application is fast becoming a really important mechanism, and especially to the financial market players, and of course the market authorities as well. So the region, of course, is now seeing this immense growth in green and sustainable finance market, undergoing that exponential growth. And so without that as well, of course, there's a lot of scrutiny into possible greenwash allegations and, the confusing landscape of labels and standards, exactly what the panel before was talking about. Of course, with this, we're going to introduce Dr. Ma Jun. It's my pleasure to be beaming him in live from Beijing. Just a very quick introduction, if you don't mind, Dr. Ma. So Dr. Ma Jun is the Director of Director of Center for Finance and Development at Tsinghua University. He's also the chairman of China's Green Finance Committee and a member of the Monetary Policy Committee for China's Central Bank, the PBOC. He wore many other hats, including the chairing of G20 Green Finance Study Group, as well as the Hong Kong Green Finance Association as well. So Dr. Ma, it is my pleasure to have you join us today from Beijing. You're looking good, and the background is beautiful. All right, Dr. Ma, our fireside chat today aims to leverage on Asia's momentum to forge a common, harmonized, and unilateral way forward. And you have been a key driver of all that, of the taxonomy development in China and many other things. And in particular, the common ground taxonomy that seeks to synergize the EU's green taxonomy as well as China's. I'd like to hear a little bit about your vision for the ideal state in building that common language in sustainable finance. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Junice. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Great. Just to clarify, one thing that you mentioned, I'm no longer a member of Monetary Policy Committee. I was former member of the PBOC Monetary Policy Committee. Now, back to the Common Ground Taxonomy, it was initiated back almost 3 years ago when EU was thinking about launching a platform. It's called International Platform for Sustainable Finance. And they approached us at the PBOC and asking, whether China would be interested in joining, what other activities we're looking to launch under the platform. So China said yes, and we proposed to launch a working group under the IPSF to discuss how to forge some sort of alliance on common language for definition of green and sustainable finance activities. And that was the origin of the working group on Common Ground Taxonomy. So I was appointed as the co-chair of the IPSF Taxonomy Working Group, working with Marcel Hack from EU. In the past 2 years, this group, including the working group members and also the expert group members, worked very hard and produced 2 versions of Common Ground Taxonomy. The first version was out in November last year during the COP. And the second version was published in June this year. Now, intention is very clear. We want some sort of similar language that can help both China and European markets to identify green and sustainable activities. So financial products labeled by the Common Ground Taxonomy can be sold in both markets or can help facilitate the cross-border green capital flows. And because at that time, 2 years ago, there's only China and EU had sort of a taxonomy type of work. China, in fact, had 3 taxonomies already, one for green lending, one for green bonds, one for green products. And EU was developing a fairly sizable taxonomy. It's now looking like a 500-page and a lot of categories. But the issue is that both taxonomy are written in different language, meaning they are written using different classification, and it was very difficult to compare if they were written in different language. So the working group began to actually convert the two taxonomy, including the Chinese green bond taxonomy and the EU taxonomy climate portion, into the same language. That's ISIC, International Standard Industrial Classification. That process took us 9 months for the conversion. Then we began to compare, and a comparison led to the production of the first version of Common Ground Taxonomy that included 55 activities in the climate mitigation space, which are both recognized by EU and China. That was version 1. And the second version, it took us another 6 months, and we added another 17 activities, including 16 manufacturing activities and 1 in the new building space. And that forms the new version of the taxonomy, Common Ground Taxonomy, which includes 72 climate mitigation activities. That's consistent with both the Chinese and EU taxonomy. I think it's a first step towards some sort of a harmonization of taxonomy in major markets, including China and EU. And in fact, it's being used in the markets already in the past couple of months. 4 major Chinese issuers, including Bank of China, Construction Bank, and so on, they have issued international green bonds using CGT as a label. So they could be sold more easily in international markets, especially accepted by the European investors. And more are coming. I'm hearing actually many more transactions coming to using CGT as a label, including green loans, syndication loans, and so on. But also, I think the reverse may be true. If foreign institutions wanting to issue green bonds in China in the pendant bond market, they could use Common Ground Taxonomy. And there's some potential transactions, I think, are being planned in this regard. Also, we've been talking about the usage of CGT to label other financial products. For example, a green bond fund consisting of green bonds that's labeled by CGT, they can be sold in the international market with underlying assets coming from China. And tomorrow, in fact, we're going to have the Hong Kong Green Finance Association annual meeting, and we'll be publishing 1 report on 6 usages of the Common Ground Taxonomy. It's going to be more than what's been seen already. And internationally, there's some usage of the Common Ground Taxonomy already. For example, Sri Lanka, which published a green finance taxonomy recently, they used the Common Ground Taxonomy as a main building block, which means that they use CGT plus some other activities. And Habib Bank from Pakistan, they actually adopted a Common Ground Taxonomy-based taxonomy for internal usage. And Hong Kong Monetary Authority said that they will introduce a taxonomy, which again is based on Common Ground Taxonomy. So it's clear, I think, the CGT is becoming an important building block of many other taxonomies going forward.
This is really encouraging to hear. And I think that traction speaks for itself. You've given really good examples of, the adoption of it. Do you think there is a strategic significance to this harmonization now, especially now, of course, between China and the EU, but, ASEAN has its own taxonomy too, and many others are being constructed at the same time. Where do you see this going?
Now, the importance of this work is that it helps address a couple of problems arising from the proliferation of too many taxonomies. If you've got too many taxonomies which are developed in silo, they may end up with market segmentation, with increased transaction costs, especially verification costs, and could increase the risk of greenwashing, as you mentioned earlier. So with adoption of some sort of a common taxonomy, these risks are being managed. And certainly, we believe this CGT is not going to be for China and EU only. We think it's going to be spreading to many other places, either in the form of being used as a reference for their taxonomy, as a building block for taxonomy, or it could potentially become a reference point for developing some sort of a global taxonomy going forward.
Right, thank you. I'd like to perhaps stay with the Asian context a little bit more. From your lens, especially sitting from China, there's a lot of opportunity for Asia to do more with China. When I talk about Asia, of course, I mean ASEAN in particular. There's a lot to learn as well from both sides. Do you see, what are the important drivers for this to happen? And of course, as well, maybe perhaps a lens on potential pitfalls or challenges? Anything that we should take note of?
For ASEAN, now I think there are a lot of collaboration potentials between China, ASEAN, and between the rest of the world and ASEAN. For example, I've been hearing discussion on taxonomies already in the past couple of years, and I was in fact involved in quite a few webinars and so on, introducing China and also the CGT experience to them. I think there's some conversation which allow us to mutually learn from each other in terms of taxonomy development and forging some sort of a common elements in the taxonomies. And but just go higher in terms of the framework for sustainable financing ASEAN. I think we need at least 4 major pillars. This actually applies to any markets. Number one, we need a taxonomy which is credible and being adopted by majority of the participants in the market. And secondly, disclosure standards. Globally, I think most economies are looking at ISSB as a potential framework for globally consistent reporting standards for sustainability, and many other parts, including in China, we're looking at that as well. So if ASEAN and China and EU are sort of converging towards the ISSB-based reporting standards, it will allow more cross-border capital flows and a better recognition of green elements and environmental impact from each other. And the third pillar is what I call incentives. We need to really incentivize the private sector to get exposure to green and transition activities, despite the fact that initially some of these projects may not be very profitable. So we can mutually learn from each other on the type of incentive we have introduced. In China, just to give you one example, the PBOC introduced the decarbonization facility last year, which offers low-cost funding through commercial banks to support low carbon projects. And the funding cost is only 1.75%, which is, I guess, at least 2 percentage points lower than the market rate. That's sort of a subsidy, but not so much from the fiscal authority, but it's from the central bank. And that kind of arrangement is being discussed, I think, in many other parts of the market. And finally, we need a lot more products than just the typical ones like the green loans and green bonds. Just to give you one example, in this year, under the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, which I co-chair, we are talking about the transition finance and transition finance products, which in the form of equity, bonds, loans, and insurance products, I think will be very important in support a very large set of activities that are moving from carbon intensive towards low and net zero going forward.
Thank you. I'm going to just tease a little bit about China now. There is a focus on the EU-China cooperation, and one of the things that China has launched recently is its emissions trading mechanism last year. That said, there was some bumpiness in the launch. It was, I think that the result of that wasn't as swift as many would have expected. How has the CGT helped, this progress, or how can it help progress this further?
So far, I'm not seeing much relevance of CGT to the emission trading system. Emission trading system is largely a mechanism for the companies covered by the ETS to trade with each other. But going forward, I think if we have a voluntary carbon market, in fact, China has one, but it's to be reactivated as CCER market. And the voluntary carbon markets could actually entertain more carbon reduction activities from, for example, renewable, from building, from forestry industry. And many of these activities actually may qualify CGT. Yeah. So on the one hand, they may get financing from banks and the bond market when their products are labeled against CGT. At the same time, these companies may benefit from selling their carbon credit in the voluntary carbon markets.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ma. All right, I'm just going to pause here and perhaps take any questions that we may have on taxonomy development. It could not be just as China, but also in the region. Is there anyone perhaps that might have anything to ask? Okay, I think we have one over there. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Marjin and Janice. Wyman from Eco Business. I write for Eco Business and cover China. Just wanted to ask Dr. Marjin, the EU also has the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM, seen together with the CGT. I've seen Southeast Asian commentators raise concerns and worries about how this unilateral action might actually have geopolitical significance, given that I mean it's CBAM, it's EU and China identifying and marking what's green financial activity, and I think it's linked with what Junie said about ASEAN having its own taxonomy. How what would your reaction be to such concerns from the Southeast Asian market? Thank you.
In fact, a research group which I participated has studied the impact of CBAM on developing countries. And there was a publication by a group of specialists in Peking University. They actually published that report on the website. It's based on a model which shows that the adoption of CBAM may have negative impact on some developing countries in terms of the income growth, in terms of export growth and employment, largely because these countries are exporting carbon-intensive products to Europe, and in the future they will be levied. Now, the conclusion of that report is actually about how to mitigate these distributional impacts, which are negative for some developing countries. And it ended up with one proposal, which is if CBAM is to continue and operate, can CBAM use its revenue to help developing countries, especially those that are negatively affected, for example, by allocating some of the CBAM revenue to fund climate actions in developing countries, and especially in funding their green technologies.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I want to turn to Hong Kong, actually, because Hong Kong has always been known as Asia's financial hub as well. And there is so much interest now to integrate CGT in a lot more of its financing mechanisms, especially towards sustainable finance. Do you see, what I guess, you know, what do you see as the most exciting thing to look out for in the next 12 months?
I think Hong Kong will develop a taxonomy. I don't know exact name, whether it's green finance taxonomy or sustainable finance taxonomy, but the HKM has said it's going to be based on CGT, which I expect it to be CGT plus something, meaning the 72 activities coming from CGT will be largely in the Hong Kong taxonomy, but there might be some other activities which could be transitional in Hong Kong, and it's important for its decarbonization. For example, the building sector in Hong Kong, transportation sector, which I think account for majority of carbon. They need some Hong Kong specific activities which are recognized in the Hong Kong version of taxonomy.
Right. Okay, excellent. There's a lot to be excited about there. I guess maybe one last question, if I may, and we can definitely let everyone go for lunch. I think it's really the outlook now. There is really a lot of interest to integrate this into into the thinking here for the banks as well as the financial authorities. If we were to give advice to the central banks as well in terms of what to look out for in their own considerations on taxonomies moving forward. Of course, you have many different types, the principles-based one, etc. What would you then give advice to in terms of like what should they look out for?
I think for regulators, the G20 Sustainable Finance Roadmap is a very important document. They should look at the 19 actions which we proposed last year. They pretty much would guide many of the regulators in their future work on building an ecosystem for sustainable finance in the coming few years. For example, the key elements include developing taxonomies, developing disclosure requirements along with in line with ISSB, and developing risk analysis tools, and producing incentives and products. But for private sector, I would encourage you to pay attention to the forthcoming G20 transition finance framework. It's being drafted, and it will be discussed in a few days in the fourth meeting of the working group this year, which is the last meeting. And I hope it's going to be pretty much finalized by then. Then we'll be submitting to the finance minister, central bank governors in October, getting approval, and finally, we should get it endorsed by the G20 leaders in Bali in November. And from then on, I think this document of transition finance framework will be a very important guide for many countries to develop the transition finance arrangement and products going forward.
Can you give us a little bit of insight into the transition paper recommendations?
We recommended 5 pillars under the transition finance framework, which include number 1, we need approach to identify what transition activities are to prevent transition wash. Number 2, we need to have disclosure requirements, which include disclosure of information about transition plan of the company that's raising money. And number 3, we need a range of products, including not only debt, but also equity. And number 4, incentives to make transition projects bankable. And number 5, it's about just transition. Just give you one example of just transition. We are hoping that many of the transition related deals will support transition activities that will not lead to huge unemployment. So if the company is doing something to mitigate the negative impact on labor, for example, through developing retraining, reskilling program, they should be incentivized by the finances. That's what we propose.
Fantastic. Excellent. Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to just one last round. Is there any last questions we may take? If not, thank you so much, Dr. Ma. It's been a pleasure having you, and we hope to see you again. I'll see you in Beijing perhaps next time. Thank you again.
Thank you, Junior. Thanks, everyone.